So the kiln is kind of like the Death Star, is it? Being designed with this built-in flaw or feature for the heroes to use to their advantage through skill and intellect. Cool, actually. We got my favorite sequence of the franchise out of it maybe after Rocket's resuscitation, though I still to this day question not completing the trilogy with composer Tyler Bates, responsible for at least half of my initial infatuation. Someone didn't omit the prerequisite that is a memorable soundtrack for any space opera worthy of the genre. If you're a space opera with a mid soundtrack, might as well pack it up. Every time I look at that poster, the theme just screams at me. Right into my veins it went. The moment those doors opened, showing the Guardians all sharing a frame for the first time. Right there, they got me. And the appeal is embarrassingly simple. As simple as the reason a child gets hooked onto something, a feeling that becomes harder to get from someone the older they get. Yet James has this knack of still making it happen. He and Denis Villeneuve sharing the same sentence isn't as insane as one might think it is, as they both figured out that potent editor-composer chemistry of matching the right image with the right score to create those goosebump-inducing moments. Tonally and aesthetically, they're both fire and ice and are both my boys. This shot, its musical motif, the scene's ascending pace, rhythm, weight, and suspense, the culmination of a well-thought-out, playfully executed plan, displaying all the character traits which earned them their notoriety. I love the kiln escape. All my homies love the kiln escape. I wish I came up with the kiln escape. Why even talk about anything else? Like Ronan, who's just as boring as we all remember. I'm not wasting word count on bashing the guy. Lee Pace is an innocent man and was given nothing. Fortunately, his screen time was relatively minimal, lessening the blow. Summer 2014 kept on spoiling us for some reason with this film as the closing piece. Barely recognizable to me a decade later despite recalling a time when I could recite the whole thing from start to finish. A time when new Marvel entries had to actually try to prove themselves worth a franchise, signaling some importance within the grand scheme of things, unlike later gun films, giving this one sort of a Phase 1 feel in its tonal and visual essence, as unlikely this would have been in the actual Phase 1, with the MCU being a little too vanilla in its early stages to dance with the cosmos. Still, I could taste from it a late 90s to early 2000s flavor, perhaps from the credits coming in and out as the film opens, old school style, bringing me back to Stuart Little for some reason. The film also totally fits into that category of author-filmmaker-driven trilogies defining that filmic decade in my eyes, which is one of the most precious qualities to which I could attribute a modern franchise. Now, my general idea of a Guardians of the Galaxy movie shifted over the years after having gotten myself familiarized with James Gunn's filmic quirks, here feeling surprisingly suppressed upon revisitation. The writing feels noticeably more MCU, i.e. more generic, and less James Gunnish, with all the more James Gunnish lines coming off as more jarring for it. You know, that thing James does where some exchange lingers on a specific statement by one of the characters for a minute before moving on after having made a point.
What percentage?
I don't know, 12%.
12%?
That's a fake laugh.
It's real! Totally fake. That is the most real, authentic, hysterical laugh of my entire life because that is not a plan.
It's barely a concept.
You're taking their side?
I am Groot.
So what? It's better than 11%. What the hell does that have to do with anything? Thank you, Groot. Thank you.
This movie was still figuring out its own identity and still had to cling on other properties for reference to a degree to fill in some of the blanks, with the ending being sort of Star Trek and less unique or as poignant as James Gunn ending shots from later movies.
What should we do next? Something good? Something bad? Bit of both?
We'll follow your lead, Star-Lord.
Where should we go? As a mission of this duration has never been attempted, I defer to your good judgment, Captain.
You can also tell that his writing pace is being dragged down by this worried necessity to introduce and explain all of the universe's components. But James's tonal grit still somewhat makes it to the surface, adding characterization wherever it can fit, also preventing scenes from feeling too polished or soft, despite this movie being labeled as the funny one. Like spit coming out of that dude's mouth yelling out orders, or this one lady's sentence for God knows what, waving longingly at her family via hologram. Did I say that I like the kiln? What's mostly a shame is James's visual signature, still pending approval at the time, so no snap zooms, no quick pans, no track shots, none of that James Gunn kineticism permeating the film language, leaving us with cinematographer Ben Davis, responsible for the MCU's reputation of being visually barren, mostly taking the wheel. I miss not knowing what cinematography was. I miss not caring about most MCU movies looking parched. back when I wasn't constantly wishing something were directed by J.J. Abrams or the Wachowski sisters instead. They who create vibrance out of the bleakest environments, making all this look like the biggest waste of clearly colorful assets I've seen on this scope due to all the in-camera choices not doing it any bit of justice. The Dark Aster's interior, Ronan's ship, is the absolute worst, filling my script cap folder with a bunch of pitch black thumbnails with Nebula's forehead occasionally giving it a shine. Being a Zealot-owned lightless flagship shouldn't prevent the possibility of some compositional appeal. I point to Villeneuve's Harkonnen as that vibe's superior aesthetic execution. I see the practical sets and we're only one color grade away from Prometheus. Bummer. Your ghoulish control room operators seem fun, wish I could see them. Where's Greg Fraser when you need him? There are definitely some fun shot choices hinting at what James is really made of, but that color grade just chokes it. Xandar's undeniably well-rendered landscape is relentlessly made flat shown through the blandest computer-animated camera angles, making me wish I were watching Tomorrowland instead. Where's Claudio Miranda when you need him? Nowhere, as fine as it looks, now reminding me of Arcane at times, could have had so much more of a visual crunch to it if it weren't for that suffocating color palette, reducing it all to a smudge sprinkled with lights of ambiguous sources, which kind of summarizes the general canvas, with the fully CG establishing shots looking the best, probably due to solely being handled by the VFX artist directed by James. Coming fresh from Volume 3 magnifies Henry Braham's absence, and I can't help but compare. Volume 1, the faces are flatly lit, devoid of texture. The characters melt onto their backgrounds despite some discernibly good blocking. The interiors of vehicles are underlit. I yearn for the lens flares. Volume 3, Let There Be Light. The lighting itself is emotive. The characters seem like they're actually breathing. It's like they want you to actually see the design effort put into the cockpit, making you just want to touch and press everything in sight. Every aspect of the mise-en-scène has been dialed up, sharpening the separation between characters and their backgrounds. Actual contrast. Glad Henry saw the memo. Ben Davis is not a bad cinematographer, just maybe keep him away from comic books unless directed by Matthew Vaughn. The color palette was fortunately not enough to conceal all the things through which James was allowed to shine aesthetically, putting those circular mechanical gates everywhere he could to frame whatever subject, detailing any environmental asset regardless of the length of the shot in which they're shown, with the kiln of course as the standout, held by the fact that the scene's context imposes onto it the best lighting circumstances from flying bullets to prison spotlights for natural flare. The kiln is no Death Star, but aesthetic revolution isn't essential to my satisfaction. Every door and hallway are relentlessly detailed, covered with precision I personally wouldn't have thought of, heavy in oddly diagonal shapes and convincing levels of fictitious engineering, somehow making it all feel otherworldly despite its human reference. It feels authentic and not reduced to that necessary location to pass through to get to the next plot point. It's like they cared. I guess that's what happens when money's put in all the right places. Speaking of money, behold the MCU's best CG, ageless to this day. James established that VFX team relationship reputation since day one with the mission of keeping the cleanest streak. There's enough of it here for several space operas, and it's weirdly consistent, from the ship rendering, the environmental depth, to the creature animation. If one of those aspects faltered, that would have been the whole movie in the can since it all rides on it. Subpar effects would have clashed with the sincerity with which Rocket and Groot are handled with, probably what makes this the MCU's most comic book feeling movie for being so conceptually outlandish and for the comic book matter-of-fact earnest way how said concepts are presented, through which I believe James to have nurtured one of his strongest qualities. The punchline was never that there's a talking raccoon, but rather him not even knowing what that is. His best friend's a tree. And we've seen Stranger Things by this point. There's a franchise worth of cosmos to establish. Time's not gonna be wasted on expressing how weird they think the material is. James doesn't have that insecurity. The quote-unquote self-awareness maybe stops at the Star-Lord name drop, but even it has its own emotionally weighty narrative justification. Beyond Quill wanting to distance themselves from the Ravagers, desperately seeking individuality through that surname and failing. Unfortunate how every MCU writer only saw ripeness for a gag and dragged it out until they ran out of characters audiences cared about whose name they could make fun of. Very sad. Imagine secretly being a studio's most sincere filmmaker, using comedy to better ease your audiences into some obscure comic book property and have the biggest takeaway be pointing and laughing at the material given to adapt. I forgot that Quill's actually not a complete clown displaying a fair share of quick thinking and necessary diplomacy. He's just a man-sized kid stuck in space who occasionally lets his emotion get the best of him. Relatable. You just can't have two himbos on the same team, even if Drax doesn't yet completely present as such. But James, being avant-garde, both fed and foresaw that archetype's popularity, so just crank that up in later volumes. Everyone feels kind of subdued, and even their designs and makeups make them radiate a different aura from where they end up. Drax has got those bloodshot, piercing wolfen eyes, glowing with hate and rage. Rocket looks hilariously more rabid with this constant feral glare instead of the softer, sympathetic gaze he's later given. I just forgot how the high chances of getting killed first saying the wrong thing the wrong way at the wrong time was a big part of the ensemble's initial appeal. Even better coming from characters who look straight out of your favorite AAA sci-fi game. Peak comic to film translation at that, by the way, and for all the right changes and inspired decisions applied to them, such as making Drax's patterns look more like a bunch of lightning scars rather than just tats, or giving Gamora purple hair for better contrast instead of green on green skin, like her comic counterpart. She just looked like a green variant of the Sovereign. That's the creative confidence I'm here for when it comes to the task of adaptation. Whether it's inside of a dead god's skull or a space prison, it just brings out the kid out of me, which I guess is another way to say that it all make for a nice theme park. Not something I can say about every MCU sci-fi entry. The austere, monolithic, symbol-riddled look of the Eternals not saved by the presentation is what I think happens to concept artists after they've been kissed by a Dementor or gone to whatever room that is. Captain Marvel is a whole platter of alien vistas, so bland I feel like I could envision something better myself, which is something no audience member should ever feel when looking at high-budget sci-fi. My rule is, if it doesn't make you wish you could play it, send it back. Every set piece in Volume 1 could make for a decent video game level in concept and in aesthetic, not to mention that the whole thing feels heavily Star Fox coded, so I personally never stood a chance. Every prop, every weapon is seemingly made with this burning phobia of ever possibly being regarded as bland or generic. I'm especially appealed by the visual of Ronan's ship looking like gears tacked onto each other, spinning at different levels of alignment. You'd almost forget that you're watching an MCU film for how well the overall aesthetic just stands on its own. Not to discredit the concept artists manifesting it all, but they could have been told to make something beneath their talent by a director seemingly devoid of any interest in the playground that is science fiction, like in Captain Marvel. Sorry. Are the presets all I have to talk about even a decade later? Yeah. Or pay me. Some of you know that my worst enemies are sci-fi films which either have no sauce or those who waste it all on works forgotten or remembered for all the wrong reasons. History says we're only allowed one good space opera per decade, so I won't pass on a chance to express relief in seeing it all spared for something people actually enjoyed as a whole, even if Disney's the seller, as sad as that sounds. I hope I've said at least one new thing despite this feeling like a decade late review. I was unfortunately still a bit baby-pilled back in that blessed year. Having a better grasp on the creative decisions that allowed it to click as well as it did only make it weirder that a good space opera didn't reoccur elsewhere post its release, or at least a few more successful instances. The real flex here, I think, is this being the Avengers only made on a higher difficulty level for not having each member equipped with their own standalone film for people to walk in with pre-established attachment. This movie had all the work to do, including setting up all the factions in between unique to those movies, but I think the Guardians mainly being from space suppresses a necessity to thoroughly explain and visualize everyone's cosmically weird upbringing, or at least on the moment. Space do be having funny people in it. It is what it is. Moving on. Remember people name-dropping Star Wars for comparison, which might be indicative of the miracle that is a good space opera. Flashback to me comparing the kiln to the Death Star. These things are not alike though, just like their respective films, maybe in tone but that's it, maybe a set of character archetypes and a few aesthetic conventions. This definitely could have been an original property for how figuratively and literally distant it is from the rest of the Feige orchestrated ruckus, with this volume being the least intimate and self-contained of the trilogy for having to focus on some rock. Remember when every MCU entry had to do the best they could to hide the fact that they were being held in a narrative chokehold by some evil eggplant? Can't lie, I kinda miss it. 2014 nostalgia is real, and the reasons for which I love this are felt tenfold, and the reasons why I love it less than I could have are harder to brush aside. Scrolling through some of those thumbnails is torture, but it's hard living in a world where being the best looking doesn't make you the best. Sorry JJ, someone needs to hook you up with better writers and maybe workshop your endings. We're breaking you out of director's jail soon, I promise. James being the only MCU director owning a strict character-focused trilogy has some worth, and it's hard to dissociate its appeal from what is now recognized as James's thing. And he's still at it, from adapting the most obscure material to what's now seen as a sacred icon of American pop culture. Look at him go. Imagine having the ambitious space operatic entry as your practice round. I'll always find myself lucky to go back to a film I haven't seen in years and be awestruck at things I might have once taken for granted. Whether it's the clear surface or simple backdrops made with care despite not calling attention to themselves, indicative of a sincere, unpretentious love for science fiction. Love to see it. Thank goodness it's an actually good film. Coming back to it didn't hurt. That poster staying on the wall.